Hello, welcome. My name is Nikki Harrison. Welcome to this webinar on the 3 most effective ways to tackle your wellbeing strategy. This webinar will reflect back on some of the content from Yoke's breakfast strategy sessions last week. And as a bit of an introduction to Yoke, our mission is to empower every workforce with wellbeing, and we work with a range of companies to help them deliver an effective wellbeing strategy. So now over to Rachel Arkle, Director of Yoke Consultancy, to start us off. Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Nikki. We're really excited about hosting the Mop-Up webinar because we're conscious that there's quite a number of people that couldn't attend the breakfast session. So our aim for today is to bring a bit of flavour and also an interaction piece. So part of Nikki's role, and we'll hand back at various different points, will be to try and gather some questions. So we are going to be walking through some of the exercises that we touched on in the breakfast. And I think Nikki will ask you to either put your hand up using the relevant technology or even writing her a message or an email so that she can get the relevant questions through at the appropriate time. So just to start with, and I know Nikki's already introduced myself and her, but we are a team of 4 consultants, but we also have an expert base around wellbeing of an extra 14. So we're a nice size, but our overall mission is to empower every workforce with wellbeing. And we do this in 3 different forms. Firstly, by helping people with their strategy. Secondly, by wider consultancy. And then third, we deliver accredited wellbeing training programs. And we are the first company in the UK to have an accredited wellbeing training program. So just to be clear, the session today will just cover that first part, so the strategy building. And we're going to cover some of our thoughts about the industry and also the 3-step process, which we perceive to be the most effective way to begin to understand wellbeing. So the intention for the session is just to give you a bit of an introduction as to the way that we help our clients think a little bit differently about wellbeing. So we often interact with HR managers who have a very extensive to-do list already on their plate. And the reality is wellbeing is now another thing that they have to address. So rather than it being deemed as an extra overhead, we try and make people or help people think cleverly about how wellbeing can actually unlock about a lot of other things that are on the HR agenda. So with this sort of context, we'd like to challenge your thinking around wellbeing. And most interestingly, probably what came out from the breakfast, challenge people's perception about what they're doing today. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is create a community of people that are trying to think differently. And so, yes, it would be great if you ask questions today. And also, we will be kind of picking up on some of the key questions that came out of the breakfast. But ultimately, we're trying to create a sustainable forum for ongoing ideas exchange, where you all feel open to just share ideas, and it's a very safe community space. So off the back of this, there will be a couple of call to actions, of which one is a talk with us, but Nikki will also be inviting you to our LinkedIn forum where there is already interaction going on about the latest thinking, articles and events coming up. So I guess we included this slide just to make sure you knew it actually happened. But on Monday and Tuesday last week, we had 2 strategy sessions. We had 40 people across the 2 days, and it was fascinating from our perspective, primarily due to the breadth of people that came along. So everyone from Babcock, so from an engineering perspective, to Capita, who are very much sort of in a similar space but complementing what we're delivering, to small technology companies, and also larger banks such as Schroders and further professional services companies like the Bar Council. So everybody with a very different story and a different agenda. And interestingly, the model that we followed, a lot of the concerns and challenges and obstacles that people are facing today were actually very similar. So what we're going to talk through, just to make it really clear from an agenda perspective, I'm conscious we did put an hour in, but we've learned from many webinars now that we try and keep it to 45 minutes. So as we've done so far, we're sort of on track, the first couple of minutes being an introduction. And then we're going to spend about 10 minutes on each part of our model. the why, the how, the what, which I'll come on to shortly, with an opportunity for any quick questions after the first 15 minutes, and then obviously further questions at the end. So a little bit of context from our perspective. We sort of see a 5-pronged approach or well-being ladder, I guess, for the market at the moment. So from Yoke's perspective, we do some consultations with the US market that is far more mature than the UK, and as a result, going on in HR in the UK, but also where they might go to based on the US insight. And in the context of well-being, we're seeing majority of people starting off wanting to be proactive, but ultimately reacting to well-being. And the key kind of indicator for us for this is the idea of having ad hoc well-being days. And in essence, we kind of, from our perspective, see this as a knee-jerk reaction, a really healthy first step forward. But in terms of creating a real culture for well-being, a one-off event doesn't really instill any of the ultimate mission about empowering your people with the well-being skill set. Then there are the more sophisticated companies such as Boeing, and Nikki's going to send out a case study link afterwards just to add a bit more substance to this. But people are beginning to think differently about well-being, and not simply about helping people be more productive, but it's also about using it as a tool for competitive advantage. And interestingly, Boeing does this around talent. So not just holding on to credible talent whose values are very much more about creating a sustainable lifestyle, but also about how do you attract people that are hugely talented in your arena, but also demand well-being as one of their key values. Above and beyond this, there's 3 sort of interesting things that are going on. There is already the seeds of a regulatory need, or the idea that we need to start evidencing what we're doing, in particular around mental health and stress for individuals or the employees that you work with. By 2018, it's predicted that this audit trail would be far more significant. And as a result, it's helpful to start thinking strategically about how to create the appropriate channels to get the data in place before this necessity takes off. And then the 4th and 5th prong of the ladder, which at the moment is kind of a stretch for many of the UK organisations that we work for, but it's the idea of creating well-being, very much having it within your culture. So the authenticity, that it isn't just a bolt-on, but actually it's the way that we talk to each other. It's the way that we engage with our clients. I know that Amy Shawbridge from the Virgin Group often talked about this at the latest talent conference, where she very much says if we have a wellbeing workforce, that naturally ripples into the experience of our customers. And off the back of that, it's touching on the idea of a new wave of HR, whereby actually the employee has full empowerment to make their own choices. So, of which a wellbeing offering that is strategic and helpful is part of that. In short, I guess what we're finding, and also some academic research, my background is actually starting off in academia. I have a master's in organisational wellbeing, and off that have merged that with my consultancy skills. And from both the consultancy hat and the academic hat, there seems to be this sort of feel that there's a 40% of people's productivity is untapped. So we have a learning and development area. The majority of those learning and development skills are oriented towards external accreditations. And very little is about unlocking that person's potential based on their relationship with themselves, i.e., how well do they look after themselves? And this is, I guess, the productivity area that we're really going to work towards today. So to kick us off, a very basic model, but something that's really, really interesting from a gentleman called Simon Sinek. Some of you may or may not have actually heard of this, so please reach out to Nikki and just show your hand if you have. That's great. A couple of you are coming through saying you have seen this model, and it's actually typically used in the sales area, whereby companies try and apply and understand how certain different organisations create success with their messaging. So by way of example, let's use the obvious, Apple. So why are they so successful from their marketing perspective? Well, the difference is the majority of companies start from outside in, i.e., they start by saying to the market what they do, i.e., we sell computers. How they do it? Well, we create really interesting, cleverly designed computers. And then at the end of it, it's want to buy one? The difference with Apple and their approach is they very much start from a mission perspective. They start with their reason as to why they're actually beginning to create some interesting products in the first place. So the whole ethos around why you want to buy an Apple product is because you want to buy into this mission that they want to disrupt the market, do something really exciting and innovative. How they do that? They create beautifully designed, cost-effective products. That is, as a result, a MacBook Air. Want to buy one? And the thread of thought is very different. And we apply this to the well-being strategy space because, interestingly, we hear many organizations start from outside in. So they come to us and say, well, we're doing a well-being workshop. We go out to our clients or our employees and we say, we're holding a well-being week. We've got 6 providers coming along. Want to join us? And they often wonder why uptake is so low. So what we want to start with today is just begin to say, fundamentally, why? Why are you thinking about well-being? So try and remove all the reality of what you're actually doing if you're doing anything already. But what primary problem are you trying to solve? How does this affect your organization today? And most interestingly, how does this make you feel? Because the majority of people on this call are actually responsible to a degree for well-being. So we'd love to hear your thoughts. I think Nikki's going to step in shortly and share a few ideas about the whys that came from the workshop and also just chat through any of the other feedback that might be coming through from the chat box. And I'll help sort of summarise at the back of this.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. We just actually had one quite interesting question come through, which was saying, yes, I know that there is a why out there, but I just don't know where to get the data from and I don't know what to trust. Can you comment on that for us quickly?
Thanks, Nikki. That's a really great question, something that often comes up for many of our clients. And I think this need for data is almost part of an uncertainty as to why you're doing it in the first place. So I think returning back to that model, the data will validate the how and the what, so the effectiveness of what you're doing. But the real reason why has to come back to almost that emotive reason. What is the fundamental reason that you are trying to have something that could create interesting cultural change? So from the workshops, I think it's most helpful to reflect on the breakfast sessions because in many of the academic papers you look and it's very almost data driven. And the 3 top areas that you see from an academia sort of reporting arm is 1, productivity, 2, absenteeism, and 3, retention rates. So these are 3 very valid but clear reasons as to why people are having a strategy. Most interestingly, though, however, these 3 were mentioned on the breakfast sessions, but the 2 that really came up for many of the people in the room were all about engagement and also about culture. And these were the far softer and actually, interestingly, more difficult to validate directly through quantitative data. But at the heart of it, the qualitative reasons were those facts that drove the wellbeing programme. Any reflections from you, Nikki, or anything else that's coming through?
Yeah, definitely. I'm just looking back over our notes from the breakfast strategy sessions last week. And I think how we kind of pulled it together in a nutshell was that some of the most commonly talked about reasons why you would create a wellbeing program would be around stress, productivity, and satisfaction. And you're right, those are the things that really link back to that quantitative data and will be able to challenge our ultimate profit line. But interestingly, like you said, what was discussed most in the sessions came sort of more from the qualitative and heart-led side, but also the most challenging reasons around creating a culture of loyalty and trust, which would ultimately lead to higher talent retention. A couple of other reasons why you would create a wellbeing program that came up last week, and these were the really exciting points, came around employee choice and employee empowerment, kind of leading off the back of what the learning and development side of HR is doing. And it's not about telling your employees this is the development program you're going to do this week, or this is the wellbeing program, but actually giving them the tools to lead it themselves. And ultimately, that would be what would undermine the kind of top line product of why you would create a wellbeing program. So yeah, I think back over to you now, if that's okay.
Thanks, Nikki. So just for awareness, I think Nikki sent through some worksheets for you, but this was just ultimately the brainstorming sheet that we had, and we sketched that out on the flip charts and tried to understand where the majority of people's thinking lay. And I think an interesting reflection on the topic was that for the 2 days, pretty much the lists were the same, regardless of who was in the room. And again, very much starting with that emotive and then almost trying to make sense of it through the quantitative. An interesting reflection point from Capita was that actually one thing that hasn't fundamentally or directly been mentioned was cost. And albeit it would be something that came as a result of increased productivity, of reduced stress, and of greater engagement, it wasn't the primary driver. It was more of the consequence or a subsequent effect off the back of something far more fundamental around the cultural piece. Are there any more questions, Nikki, coming through? Or should we move on?
I think we should move on for now. There'll be a second chance for a Q&A later in the webinar as well, so please do keep sending them through. Back over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Nikki. So I guess what I just want to leave you with before we move on to the next session is just to pose that question back to you. You know, we rarely have, because we have such busy, hectic jobs, that clear space to ask the why. So I think one of the most critical takeaways would be spend a couple of minutes in a quiet space without influence to say, A, if I am doing something today, is it really impacting my why? And B, if I'm not doing anything yet, why do I want to start creating something? And therefore really thinking mindfully about how you overlay your next steps. So as I touched on, 3 from an organisational academic perspective of the most highly sought after reasons why: productivity, retention, and also absenteeism. But the third part there that really came strong through the breakfast was the cultural side. We chatted a little bit about what we might be avoiding, and I think sometimes we feel we should drive first with the quantitative, not to persuade ourselves, but to start to persuade the leaders that might be sceptical, but that actually it still came back to the softer cultural element. So I think we've had an opportunity for questions, so we'll move on. So I guess with that why, we then start to think of the how. So if we're really clear about why we're doing something, how can we begin to solve such wellbeing objectives? And again, this sort of very simplistic model is part of the reality of the industry today, but also where we feel some of the more proactive people are beginning to move towards. So in the lighter shade of grey on the left-hand upper part of the triangle, we have health and safety. And typically this is where wellbeing in the UK has come from. And a lot of the legislation, especially as Babcock touched on in the engineering space, is primarily driven through health and safety. So a reaction to make your working environment a safe place to be. From that came the occupational health movement and the idea that actually we need to help our employees stay on track. So when things go wrong, what can we do to help them manage their well-being? It wasn't necessarily about how to stop them getting there, but when they were in a need for some additional support, there might be some occupational psychology help, counselling, or for long-term sick, some other options to support them financially. What we're now finding is this third element coming up, the idea of prevention and promotion. So what can we do proactively to stop people getting out of balance, or at least to begin to become self-aware enough to understand when things are tipping out of balance? And interestingly, identifying exactly where you fit or where you hope to fit based on your whys is a key part of driving any practical next steps from a wellbeing strategy. So, what we did off the back of this simple outline was to begin to ask another simple sketch activity. We broke out into groups about how you are currently addressing well-being. So this is very much based on the reality of today. So we can just chat through now, and again, welcome any more comments through the emails or through the chat box. But in essence, we gave the example of people having a wellbeing week, which for the majority of people was preventing ill-being and promoting well-being, but also typically because it was provided by occupational health, it also touched on the idea of understanding the channels for when things have really gone wrong. We asked people how long or the duration of each initiative, and also their priority around that from purely from themselves, from a business perspective. And I think we're going to touch on shortly with Nikki about a couple of other interesting ideas that came through. But what became clear was that majority of things that were happening were ad hoc. And I think from the overall statistics perspective, so we did a short questionnaire with each of the attendants to start with, 75% of people knew that their interventions are ad hoc. And even if we spoke to Dr. Rebecca Torrance-Jenkins, who is our actual neuroscientist, about the reality of creating new habits, new neural pathways, and what ingredients effectively are required to start creating change in your own mind, and as a consequent change in the culture or the system of an organization. And one of the two fundamental reasons to this is practice. So the reality that we need to do things, as my mum always says, little and often. And the reality that a quick ad hoc intervention will not really change anything. So we're going to go through the list now, and then I'll kind of draw a conclusion about the connections between some of the interventions that were taught. But in short, a lot of people are trying to move towards that promotional preventative space, but really not knowing how. So I'm just going to hand over to Nikki to shortly summarise some of the other interventions that were explained.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So just to summarise some of the interventions that were talked about, to give you a flavour, we've got things ranging from team away days to massages and health screenings, gym memberships, flexi working, mental health awareness weeks. So what we actually noticed was that a lot of these focused predominantly on physical health or emotional health, rather than touching on some of the wider contributors to well-being. I think something else that just triggered my memory from the breakfast strategy sessions last week was by actually taking the time to fill out this screenshot you can see here. And I encourage you to do this because we found that some clients actually realised how much they were already doing. So just to draw on Edelman, for example, once they filled out their intervention list, went beyond the 3 initiatives in the table there and realised that they were actually giving quite a lot to their employees, but it wasn't necessarily being received in the way that they hoped, and it wasn't necessarily obvious how each of their initiatives, although well intended, linked together and therefore potentially lost some of their impact along the way. So yeah, just as I said, I really encourage you to have like Rachel mentioned with the reflection on why you're creating a wellbeing program, but just take a moment to kind of address what you're already doing and see how it fits together and how it complements each other and how you're actually communicating it to your employees, because we've noticed with our clients that there's a lot of leverage to build on what you are already putting out there. So yeah, thank you very much. I'll pass you back to Rachel now.
Thanks, Nikki. And off the back of this, what we effectively did on the white paper, and I'll just flick back, and you might be able to see in one of the pictures on the top left picture, we actually mapped out all the whys to the hows. And although there are a couple of lines there, that actually took a lot of effort. And people hadn't really understood the relationship between how they were trying to address well-being and the why. So effectively, the gap between the interventions, even if they were an exhaustive list, wasn't hitting the mark of the intention of the programme at all. And this disconnect was actually being quite disruptive for two reasons. Partly on the morale of those trying to do the actual programme, because it takes a lot of effort. And if you're having a lot of effort and having minimal engagement and uptake, it's emotionally draining. But also on the employees, because they have a desire for certain things, but those things are often very different from what's been created in a dark room by HR. So again, a disconnect in terms of the actual realization of trying to empower people with well-being skills and mapping that back to the fundamental reason why, which in our majority of cases is around creating a well-orientated culture. Are there any questions that have come up from that, Nikki, that initial?
Yeah, we did actually get one question through, and I'll summarise this correctly. But it's an idea that our leadership team don't have time to know why we're doing something. They want to know how we're going to fix it. Any comments on that?
It's a really interesting one, and I think there's engagement on two folds. I think firstly up the chain to the leaders, because they are driven obviously by business cases and tangible results, but also trying to engage people down the chain. And I think this question touches on the first. The reality is, so for some organisations, and I'm not going to name any names, there is still a fundamental level of cynicism in the leadership about why we should be doing this. And as a result, their whole focus is on the data, the hard results at the end of it. So I think in this early stage, and going back to that ladder, knowing that we're in a kind of a reactive space, but ultimate end goal is to create a well-being orientated culture, there is the idea that we need to be providing the level of information that certain leaders need. And so this is where I kind of almost pick up again on certain examples of businesses that have that exhaustive list. Because if I'm a skeptical leader and I see that long list of things that I'm investing in with very limited understanding of the actual impact, I would naturally reject the lot. Whereas if I'm far more mindful that I'm presented with two things that have a clear connection back to my why, and an element of audit trail, even be it immature to start with, I'd feel far more comfortable to consider continuing if it was from a pilot stage. So I think from my perspective, yes, there is that kind of, I guess, slight anxiety that we need to prove it straight away, but really connecting the why and the how with a fundamental path to creating that leadership engagement and support.
Yes, thank you. And if you have any follow-ups to that question, do feel free to send them through to me.
Okay, so we've got about sort of 15 or 10 minutes more to go, and then a few more questions at the end. So the final link after we'd mapped the why and the how was to begin to think about a little bit more sophisticatedly, what could we be doing going forward? So how do we project this? And this is very much where Yoke came in, and I can share a little bit more about how and what we do from a wellbeing impact perspective. So to start with, we have a research-based model, and Nikki touched on elements of this earlier. So we find that there are, from the reactive space, two areas that companies start around well-being. The first, and typically off the back of health and safety, is physical health, and the second is mental and emotional health. And albeit you might be feeling that you're doing some good things in these areas, the reality is well-being is far more holistic than that. It's a dynamic model. And, the roots of it started back in the 1980s with psychologists trying to understand overall life satisfaction. So very simply asking questions to individuals, how satisfied are you with your life today? And coming up with a question numbered from 1 to 7. They then overlaid this data with demographic data and came up with certain statistics about different genders, ethnicities who could be more satisfied in life in different countries and geographies. But the reality is, as the market became more mature, or even the academic thinking became more mature, there was that sense that satisfaction as a single question doesn't really correlate to the complexity of well-being. So with that came the well-being industry from from especially in the research field. And this has gone on various different detours, especially in the UK, but ultimately even the government started to really understand and consider well-being. So we had reactions such as the happiness index, which very much linked in with Bhutan's I think the happiest place to live label, and then from that Denmark's. And they also then developed very, very complex models about what well-being could mean. So much so that the Office of National Statistics now has a model with over 42 different prongs. Now, when we said this in the breakfast sessions, there were a couple of giggles in the room, and there were a couple of tense shoulders that didn't quite know how to comprehend that should I now be tracking 42 elements of well-being? Well, absolutely fundamentally not. And that was what, through my own actual research at Lloyds Bank, we came up with a 7 domain framework. So the idea is that, and it's a proven reality, that each aspect of well-being, from relationships, networks, or your wider community, financial health, physical health, they all interact with each other, and they all influence each other in different ways that are unique to that individual. However, there are some common trends, as I've mentioned, picking up on the idea of creating new neural pathways. So you need repetition. This is your mental and emotional health, but you also need a real emotive understanding as to why you're doing that. So actually reflecting the whole point of the model that we've been working on. And as a result, your meaning and purpose really drives a huge amount of mental and emotional health. And if you begin to create a clever framework and actually a clever curriculum that helps address this complexity of well-being, anything you do that is ad hoc, won't really connect to this idea of the day-to-day frustrations and also the blurred boundaries of working life in the modern era. So from Yoke's perspective, we ask each organisation why. And I think that also doesn't just start with the HR manager. We actually go out and talk to the people from an independent space and say, what does well-being mean to you? What do you think of what people are doing already today in your organisation to help? Is this enough? And ideally, what would you like going forward? But fundamentally, digging deep into the why for that individual, and then using those people as examples as to how we then create something very interesting, but also very targeted to certain people in the organisation. And with that, you create a wide curriculum that really harbours this holistic concept of well-being. So by way of example, Yoke has an accredited wellbeing training day where we train champions that become almost our little warriors in the organisation that understand this concept, can talk around the concept, whether it be as a manager or simply as a person within the team. And then we have a wider learning curriculum that picks up on webinars, e-modules, etc., that really help engage the whole organisation to create a conversation, a learning, whether it be at work or personally remotely, to really make that sensitive, mindful and targeted impact on employee well-being. So what we did in this section was begin to explore this concept of a holistic view of well-being. And very briefly, I'll just pick up on a little bit complex for this sort of conversation because we didn't have enough time to explore it, but trying to understand, if we just looked at that domain view, of what you're doing that's a priority, how is it actually touching certain parts of the well-being? But that realization that in the majority that's based on gut feel alone. And actually from there, how do we begin to create really effective channels to gather the data that links back to the how, that links back to the why, to actually evidence and create the audit trail for yourself and your own personal validation, but also for the leaders and also for those people that are actually either participating or thinking of participating. So they understand that within the organisation as a system, why this can really create powerful change. And I think from our perspective, we feel really privileged to be providing a very clever curriculum that really is built on the essences of neuroscience and does have a collaborative and iterative approach that we engage with individuals in organisations to make sure it's interwoven into their culture to help get to the point that they really want to with wellbeing. It's a far more humanistic approach, and we feel privileged to be going down this road, but we also know it's quite a leap for many. So there are many things that you can do from a small starting perspective to ultimately get to the bigger picture in the 5 to 10 year time frame. I'm just going to hand back to Nikki to see if there are any further reflections I may have missed from the what, or if there's any other questions that have come through before we head to final sort of wrap up stage in 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. And Rachel, you're going to laugh at this question because I think I asked you it myself in my first couple of weeks of working with you, actually. But we've had a question come through saying it's great to see the wellbeing wheel, but it does look a bit overwhelming. Can you possibly be high on all aspects at once?
Thank you, Nikki. So I'll just go back to that slide to help people understand. Yeah, and this is a really interesting concept. So, and I hope, actually, I probably wouldn't say the name, but one of the banks who was in the room sort of had shared that they had actually bought a certain portion of their employee base Fitbits as part of their wellbeing program. And interestingly, what had happened through that concept was, the idea being you try and regulate your fitness, but also your sleep patterns. And we all know, even if it's from Arianna Huffington's latest book around the sleep revolution, that sleep is good for us. But actually, interestingly, whilst walking past many of the said bankers' desks, there were comments like, well, actually, I got 5 hours sleep last night. And then someone reciprocated with, well, I got 4. So this strange phenomena that competition is still there, albeit within well-being. So coming back to the question, what this is trying to do is not be right, how can we get 10 out of 10 across the board? Because it's far more of a self-reflection. We're trying to hold up a mirror and say, well, if you really, really believe that you're striving for 10 out of 10, well, I think you might get to burnout point. And actually, one of our consultants who is fantastic has also got her own personal story about this and driving too much within too many domains. And it's just a very real reality check. Again, I can bring this into personal context. So I used to love doing a lot of triathlons, and I really believe that doing a lot of physical activity helped manage some of my sort of emotional ups and downs. But what I became aware of when I started to do this process of self-reflection against the wellbeing domain framework was actually the extent of exercise I was doing was depleting me of energy and therefore exacerbating some of my anxieties. So with the framework, we're not trying to strive for 10 out of 10. We're trying to provide a way for individuals and ultimately organisations to understand the tipping point trends within themselves and within each other as a team to say, right, how can we therefore support you as an individual to stay stable in balance across the board? And this might be 10 out of 10 in one area, and it might be 6 out of 10. But if that's with awareness, then you're completely at peace with it. And it's time to sort of have that yin-yang approach of balancing and creating a well-orientated person. Any other reflections, Nikki, or questions that have come through?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to reflect back on what you said, and I think this came up at the sessions last week as well, is that not only does this change for different people, but you can expect your priorities around the wellbeing framework to change at different times. So at one point we started talking about the potential at-risk group of returning to work parents to actually reprioritize their own wellbeing and how that fits in with their new lives as parents and also in their workplace. So one of the things that I've always found most interesting with our clients is helping them understand and then relate back to their employees that this framework is allowed to change and actually we encourage it to. So there might be that 1 month you're feeling particularly low in physical health, but it's also a particular priority. But just having that awareness can bring a sense of peace because then you know what you're aiming towards. So yeah, thank you for clarifying that for our listeners. I'll pass you back over.
Yeah, I think just to conclude, it's a really interesting point. So we obviously dived a little bit into the personal level there, but if I take it back up a level to the organisational view, if I do just look purely at mental and emotional health and physical health, the other aspects might be far more of a weighted driver for individuals or for your organisation than you may have thought. So some of the research we've done with a leading management consultancy, the reason that individuals join the organisation was very much from a financial driver perspective, but actually later down the line, elements of meaning and purpose became far more prevalent. So even if you are driving mental and emotional health initiatives, the classic that we find is actually resilience programs, typically a one-off and with a lack of sort of sustainable approach off the back of it. But actually, if you're not addressing meaning and purpose in the background, these dots aren't connected. So the very reality or the potential impact you have as a wellbeing program is hugely limited. And therefore, that's why we love to kind of use this framework as the very essence of everything that we do, because it's a proven formula that we know works. As an example, we deliver wellbeing training for Schroders to all their graduate population, and we're seeing great results. And I think that this is really exciting formula that we'd love to talk more about if it's appropriate to at a separate time. But I just want to check in one more final time just to see, following the recap of, we started with the why, then the how and the what. So flipping it round to, rather than saying the what, how and why, to go from inside, starting with the emotive, getting people engaged that you want to participate in the program, getting them to really feel and understand the essence of your drivers, but also they then engage on an authentic level. So the how and the what become almost sort of just practical consequences, rather than really having to kind of jolly everybody up to get there. They're in with you, and then you create a community around it. I'm just going to pass back to Nikki just to check in if there's any final questions, and then obviously I'll just sort of define possible next steps.
Yeah, we've had one quite general question come in, so a little bit more off topic, but how have you seen the reactions to what you've been talking about with wellbeing and the wellbeing industry itself change recently? And how can you see it changing in the next year?
Thanks, Nikki. I think what was really reassuring at the breakfast was that people in the room were already doing things. And I think there was the reality we weren't quite sure the extent of education. So we're holding another event actually in July, which is probably for that person that isn't even know where to start yet. But the people in the room had started, and they hadn't started with the why, and that was very obvious, but they were doing things, and that was fantastic. I think what's really interesting, and I'm going to actually ask Nikki to rephrase the question just to make sure that I continue in the right way. Could you just repeat the question again one more time, Nikki?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question that came through was just, how have you seen reactions to what you talk about with wellbeing change, and how can you see it change in the next year?
Yeah, thank you. So it's very much from that reaction level, and I really like that. So I guess one thing, a year ago, we were talking to generic learning and development managers, and now I've actually 50% of my conversations are with wellbeing managers. So that's one shift that's far more targeted. But also, our meetings are more, I guess, strategic. So initially, it was trying to encourage people and almost hold their hand and say, why do you think, this is why we think you should consider it and we think it's relevant. We're almost not having that part of the conversation to the extent we were. They're coming to the table saying, we feel that we've been doing really good things, but we want to go to the next level. How can we do that? So we revisit the why to then create something sustainable. So to date, most people have had ad hoc interventions with a plethora of one-man bands or even internal trainers. But there is no kind of, I guess, real confidence this is having the impact that they desire. So to go that next step, it's very much on the sustainable view. And I think just in light of time, I want to sort of wrap up shortly. We're 1 minute over already. Yoke has a very consistent assess, consult, deliver model, which I've talked through. We really like starting small with that bigger picture in mind, so we really get clear with what you're trying to achieve and obviously why. We bring that to life very practically through something that is also aware of what's going on in your organisation from a wider perspective. If you're about to go and undertake a huge change piece, whether it be an organisational redesign, well, let's manage the wellbeing programme around it. And then let's deliver something. So we're really confident in the quality of what we deliver. We're really excited about the fact it's academically orientated, but also the fact that people really want it. And interestingly, Accenture, who are in the room, weren't saying that they think that they needed it. It was almost as if the people were telling them that they wanted it. So how do we then begin to feed that appetite that's actually coming from the employees? So just as a final food for thought, there's quite a lot of people that have reached out and emailed already to sort of talk with us, but just as an offer to everybody on the webinar, if you are interested to learn more about our approach and how you can get yourself far more strategic and orientated towards that why in your wellbeing program, well then please reach out to Nikki after this webinar. And I think the email was on the GoToWebinar link, but it's Nikki at yokeconsultancy.co.uk. We'd love to have a follow-up chat with you. Also, there is a little bit of an offer that if people book on today, they can get a 30-minute free coaching slot with one of our coaches. And I think Trevor is really keen to continue these conversations in particular. And Nikki will also send up a follow-up kind of summary newsletter that has all the key links to the LinkedIn group to keep you up to date with everything. So in light of time, one more check of any questions, and then I think we'll wrap up. Anything else, Nikki?
Nope, that's nothing that's come through. A thank you
Okay.
has come through, and yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thanks ever so much for your time, and we look forward to engaging with you all soon, and we'll let you know via our newsletter, so you'll all be added to our newsletter of any future either events, majority of which are based in London, or webinars that we'll be sharing with you all. Many thanks and have a good day.